All right, thank you for your attention. I'd like to introduce our next speaker now, Mr. J.R. Denson. 18 months ago, Washington, D.C. implemented the marijuana legalization initiative. Mr. J.R. Denson is was a graduate student at American University. He's a legislative aide on Capitol Hill, and he's researched Washington, D.C.'s implementation. Mr. Denson is joining us here in California to share his research. Please welcome Mr. Denson.
Right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me out, and you as well for being here to listen to this presentation. This might be a little bit different. I'm accustomed to doing these kinds of things for high school students and college students, so if I treat you like that, I hope that's okay. So that's kind of where we're at. All right. You already know a little bit about me, so before I go ahead and dive in, I'm going to have a few asterisks that I'm going to add to my presentation before we move on. The first is that I'm going to be talking about communities of color. When I use that phrase, I'm principally referring to African American communities. Second, the lack of data or statistics on a broader range of racial and ethnic groups is not because of a lack of due diligence, but because simply a lack of available data. And third, I'll be speaking very specifically about recreational use of marijuana and not medical use of marijuana. And so that's kind of my asterisk. We'll have a couple of myths and facts, and then we'll look very more in depth at what's happening in Washington, D.C. specifically, and then there'll be an ask at the end. So, is marijuana, the legalization of recreational marijuana, a civil rights issue? Take a look at these fictional people here in this picture. All right, this guy right here. What do you think he thinks about when you ask him about marijuana? Well, I'm just going to think for him since he's not real. This guy right here probably went to UC Berkeley or probably went to Colorado State. No offense. And his passport is full of stamps because he studied abroad in Europe for a semester, and he went to Amsterdam and went to some of the pot shops and had a good old time, looked at the menus, and he came back to the States, and now he's living in D.C. doing an internship on the Hill with me, and he thinks that he wants to relive that Amsterdam experience. This gentleman over here, what do you think he thinks about when you ask him about marijuana? Well, he's probably thinking about being evicted from his public housing because his grandson, against his wishes, came over and was smoking marijuana in his apartment, and that's a big no-no if you don't know anything about public housing. And so it's important to have kind of this idea, this framework going forward, and thinking about, when you ask that question about marijuana, what ideas, what thoughts, what pictures are invoked for each individual. Alright, so these are the three quick questions we're going to touch on. You can go ahead and take a look there. Go ahead and have an idea what you think about these, and we're going to go ahead and answer them now. Number one. Okay, most people that are in prison for a drug offense are there because of marijuana. That's actually false. Very few people are actually in federal prison just because they had a joint on them. Some of this was mentioned earlier. Oftentimes, if somebody's in jail for a marijuana possession charge, they also had some other charge, like they had other drugs, like cocaine or unlicensed firearm. A number of other things could have been happening in those particular situations. There are actually three other drugs that people are arrested for more than marijuana. Crystal meth, cocaine, and crack are actually, there's more drug arrests for those than marijuana. Let's go to the next one. Gangs and cartels, which mostly exist operate in communities of color, exist to sell drugs. False. If you think that gangs and cartels exist to sell drugs, number one, you've probably never met a drug dealer, which is probably a good thing. I have. And two, you don't know, you've never met one. So Let's just stick with one for now. Keep it simple, right? Kids, keep it simple, stupid. So, let's stick with one. So, lots of people join gangs for lots of different reasons. They join for protection. In DC, we never really had gangs. It's not a color you can't wear. We have something called crews in DC. And if you are in certain neighborhoods and you don't have a crew to have your back, that can be very dangerous. You're basically a dead man walking. So some people will join these groups for protection. They join them for social support. There's lots of different reasons people join gangs. And these gangs often are looking to make profits. If they can make profits selling Girl Scout cookies, they'd be pushing Samoas and Thin Mints yesterday. But they don't sell Girl Scout cookies. They sell whatever is going to make them the most money. And that happens to be, and sometimes happens in some areas to be drugs, but it's not just drugs. You may or may not already know that a lot of gangs and cartels are into human trafficking as well as illegal mining operations, just to name two different things. Number three, you would assume, or I would have assumed before doing the research that I did, that most people of color, particularly African Americans in this country, would be affirming and approve of the legalization of recreational marijuana, particularly because of the disproportionate arrest rates of African Americans. But you can see here, I'll try to help be nice to you guys over here too, you haven't been getting much love with the pointer. It may seem to suggest the opposite of what I just said. So you see Latinos, Hispanics here, 40% approval, whites 55, and blacks 58, which seems to go against my thesis, you might think. And then look at DC over here. Only 46% of African Americans in DC. What's causing that discrepancy? What could that be? Follow me. Again, well, what about civil rights? Is marijuana a civil rights issue? I think no. I think it's the people that frame it that way are actually creating and pushing a false narrative, and let's see why I think that. Look at the other big civil rights issues of 2016, the area that we live in, not just this year. I've got three up here: BLM, path to citizenship, illegal immigration, and affirmative action. One of these things is not like the other. Answer me this: when in American history have whites been more approving of civil rights issues, particularly pertaining to black folk, ever? When did they pull higher for those issues? I'll wait. Yeah, exactly. Not never. But for some reason, it seems to be a little bit different and evened out with marijuana legalization. It doesn't seem to line up with the other civil rights issues of today. Why is that? Because it's not a civil rights issue. Look at the states in which marijuana recreational use is already legal. The percentage of African Americans in particular in these first four states, DC is not a state, we'll get there in a second, is as high as 5%, a whopping 5%, and as low in Oregon as 2%. So personally, it's hard for me to believe that there's such an overwhelming sense of altruism on a majority population that they decided that we want to do something for 2% of our state. That could be just me, I'm not sure. And in just particular in Colorado, we saw this earlier, but we've heard already from Dr. Sabet that and for folks 21 years and older, it's legal, of course, to use, but for 21 and younger, it's not, and arrest rates for Latino and black youth have actually gone up, I would say, pretty significantly. So let's look at my hometown, the greatest city in the world. We decriminalized marijuana in July of 2014. Initiative 71, which I'm going to be referring to, that was the bill to legalize it fully, passed in November with 70% of the vote. DC history lesson, which, by the way, is actually a class you have to take to graduate from high school in DC history. Violent crime in DC in the 80s and 90s was pretty bad, and so was drug use. And to say that it was pretty bad is actually an understatement. When I was a kid, I wanted a pair of shoes called LA Gears. I don't know, some of you may or may not have heard of LA Gears. LA Gears were so cool because they had little red lights that would light up when you walked. And I wanted some LED gear so bad. I wanted LED gears and I wanted a starter jacket. And both of those are subsequently actually Walmart brands now. But back then, they were name brand and I wanted them. And my mother did not buy them for me. She refused to buy them for me. And not just because she was a cheapskate mom who was mean, or that we didn't necessarily have the money, even though they were expensive, but because what you may or may not know about DC at that time is in 1991, it was actually the murder capital of the US. Middle school kids and high school kids were being shot to death for their shoes and their jackets. The violence was so bad that in 1996, the NBA owner of the Washington team actually changed the name from the Bullets to the Wizards. He didn't want people coming down to the then MCI Center, which is now the Horizon Center, thinking about bullets in the city where lots of people were getting shot. I think that's fair. I like the old name better, to be honest with you. Nonetheless, in Washington, D.C., for a lot of native Washingtonians, drugs and violence are intrinsically linked and you cannot separate them, which is why 19 years later, you see in 2010 such low approval among the African American community for recreational marijuana. Only 37%. And look what happens 4 years later, in 2014. That, my friends, is what we call a statistically significant jump. 21% for African Americans, 13% for Caucasians. And what was it that caused this change in just 4 years? Well, this is one of them. The DC Cannabis Campaign. These are two images I pulled from their site. They actually ran, of course, a campaign in favor of legalization of recreational marijuana, and they ran pretty much unopposed. So up top here, you see this is an ambiguously ethnic person who seems to be triumphantly and successfully resisting arrest. And this down here says that legalization ends discrimination. Friends, if you actually believe that legalization ends discrimination, please talk to me afterwards. I have some magic beans I'd like to sell you under the conference. Please. I'm a graduate student. That was the main thing, but I think this also matters too. Look at the name of the bill. How many people, when you go into the voting booth and you see those, besides the president that you're going to vote for, you see the other bills and you actually read the little blurb under it? Most people don't. You read what the title of it says, and this looks pretty reasonable. Look at the keywords that they made sure to write to this bill. Minimal amounts. Personal use. That sounds pretty reasonable. It says nothing about the plants that you're allowed to grow in your house. Hence 70% pass rate. So let's break down that vote a little bit more. But first I want to show you the geography of DC. So we have Maryland up here, Orioles and Ravens, and Baltimore, boo. And then down here we have Virginia, no professional sports teams, yay. DC is almost half black, half white, and then the black population is in DC noted in the blue, mostly on the proverbial other side of the tracks. In DC, we don't actually have the tracks, so it's the river. The Anacostia River is where a majority of African Americans live, and subsequently also low-income areas. And then there's kind of a divide here on the west side of the city. Georgetown, which everybody's heard of, I think, is over on this area in Ward 3. Very wealthy area in Ward 3 here. So that's kind of where people live, to show you a little bit of geography and what the city looks like. Now, how the vote break down? Well, you can see the darker the green, the more people that voted for the legalization. And you can see there that the dense Caucasian areas are where the bulk of the green is. The main difference, of course, well, not the main difference, two differences. One is this outlier right here where legalization actually failed in that precinct in Ward 3 by 9 votes. And over here, you see this very light area, very few relatively to the rest of the city. African Americans in this area voted for legalization. So, JR, the problem is in DC you have Congress as your governor, so you can't regulate. So if you could just regulate, everything would be a whole lot better. Well, this was already talked about a lot earlier. I'm not going to read all these, but you can see down here, I'll just point this one out. Alcohol we regulate, and 20,000 more people that can fit into Levi across the street, the 49ers Stadium, die every year from alcohol-related causes. So, you asked me about regulating, and I have a question for you if you're asking me about regulating. I would ask, is regulating marijuana, I would say, a third vice on top of alcohol and tobacco? Is that good for a city in which there are 10 times more liquor stores than grocery stores, particularly in Ward 8, where there are only 3 full-service grocery stores in largely African-American community, and in Ward 3, there are 11 full-service grocery stores. I would ask, he's stuck here. There it goes. All right. I would ask about tobacco smoke. Low-income individuals, $20,000 to $24,000 a year income, actually smoke tobacco at twice the rate of their high-income counterparts. And we also know from some recent research that's come out that low-income individuals are actually seeing a rise in heavy usage. That's 21 days or more per month of usage. Is that good for low-income communities like Ward 8, where I grew up? So, is the legalization of marijuana a civil rights issue? I think I've been pretty clear, maybe, hopefully. No, I think it's not. I think that the evidence is also pretty clear. And specifically, communities of color are going to be the ones that are going to be the most affected in an adverse way. And I believe that anyone that continues to communicate a narrative that is different is at best just being plain unhelpful, and at worst is purposely trying to mislead and deceive for personal gain. So, what's the ask? The ask is to actually engage people of color. If you think that that's what they want, don't just take a bullet point that you read on somebody's website. Engage people of color in those communities and figure out what they actually believe and what they want. There's lots of different ways to get involved. If you actually live here in the Bay Area, there's a number of good organizations and schools that are doing great things. We have some speakers up here that are doing some great things, and you can talk to them and get involved with them. If you live on the East Coast or you live in DC, of course you can talk to me. But even easier than that, if you don't have the time to volunteer because we're all busy, you can, of course, speak to somebody here. Try to pick somebody maybe who doesn't look like you, or maybe somebody who doesn't already believe what you already believe. And then maybe, like one of my teachers used to always tell me when I was in high school, I speak to be understood, not to change your mind. I listen to understand, not simply to formulate my rebuttal. So hopefully we can all do a little bit more listening. You don't have to sing Kumbaya together, but hopefully we can learn. Thank you.
So we will take questions for Mr. Denson. If you want to just hand out the cards, we're going to keep them. Mr. Denson has graciously said that he would address any questions at the end of the day, or we can certainly email him the questions and then we can provide his answers again via the Eventbrite page. So happy to address any questions you might have for his presentation and the research that he's done.